Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And we are back in Italy tomorrow. But in between the Monte Cassino show yesterday and tomorrow, we are off to another theatre and another year of the war. Stephen K. Bailey is here to share the story of the US Navy attack on Hong Kong in 1945. His book is, of course, available in the links below, or you can find it at your favorite bookstore, etc., etc. You know the score. Here's my copy there, Target Hong Kong. I will bring him in now. How are you today, Stephen?
Very good. Thanks for having me on, Paul.
Thanks for being here. So people know the score now with a first-time guest is kind of how do you define yourself? Researcher, historian, military historian, analyst? What label do you like?
Yeah, it's a good question because, one of the questions I'm often asked is, why did you write this book? But then there's always the follow-on question. It's how is it that an English professor is writing this book about Navy pilots and Hong Kong and World War II? And the way I always answer that question is I say, well, many English professors study the great works, right? Shakespeare and Edgar Allan Poe and Emily Dickinson and all these people. But my field is a big tent, and there's people in the field of English studies who do stuff other than study the great books, and that would be me. So my specialty is that I I teach writing, and I teach nonfiction writing, and I run writing programs, and I'm a nonfiction writer as well. So I would say that in terms of how do I think of myself, it's mostly as a nonfiction writer who's telling stories, but telling true stories to non-academic audiences.
And the other thing is you're familiar with that part of the world, which always helps. Is that
Oh, so true. Yeah, yeah. And then, of course, the content of the stories is pertinent to Hong Kong and World War II, which I've always been fascinated by since I was a kid. And Hong Kong, I first visited in 1986 as a 20-year-old college student, and I was hooked basically, and I've been going back ever since.
Well, there we are. So PowerPoint today, folks. So what we'll do, usual score, big sweeping questions we'll kind of save for the end, but little ones about things on screen, aircraft types, geography, we'll deal with them as we go along. But I'll basically hand over to Stephen to take us through this story. And I was just saying to Stephen, it's one of those ones I know. What I know about this campaign, this battle, I could write on the back of a very small postage stamp. So I'm all here for the learning. So over to you, Stephen.
Yeah, thanks. Well, there's the cover of the book, and I'm going to forward onto the next slide and say that when I think about the inspiration for writing this book, I always think back to a moment where I was hiking down the backside of Hong Kong Island. I was coming down Victoria Peak on Pak Phulam Reservoir Road because I really liked hiking around in the hills in Hong Kong because if you've seen pictures of Hong Kong, you've probably seen a picture that looks a bit like this one. It's an urban space. Hong Kong is famous for its neon and its skyscrapers and so on. So you've probably seen pictures like this, or you've seen pictures like this. Hong Kong does have some of the most crowded neighborhoods in the world. It's densely populated. It's definitely urban, but it also can be beautiful. The urban scape can be really quite amazing. You've probably seen shots of the night skyline at Hong Kong. Less well known, however, is that Hong Kong has just a really amazing collection of green spaces called country parks. That's the local term for them. And I, of course, loved the urban areas of Hong Kong, but I loved hiking around in the country parks as well because they had just terrific views of mountains and clouds and ocean and rocks, and it was just amazing. They're very well maintained too. They're really amazing. And as I was hiking around in these green spaces, I kept coming across these military fortifications, and that's what I was discovering that day as I was hiking down the backside of Victoria Peak. And I was heading down slope on what was a trail. I mean, it was technically a road, but it was blocked off to traffic, so it was quite peaceful, but steep and hot. I was getting a workout, and by the side of the trail, there were these military bunkers, and the doors and windows had been bricked up. Couldn't go inside, but you could see they'd had steel shutters, steel doors of some kind, and that they were designed to be blast proof. And as I kept going down Pakfulam Reservoir Road, at the bottom there were still more fortifications, and these were fighting positions. I could see gun slits, firing ports, and it was clear that these were defensive positions of some kind. So my curiosity at that point was piqued, and I started a more systematic attempt to find all these mystery fortifications, which I understood had something to do with World War II, but I didn't really know what exactly. But I did find a lot of examples of these fortifications. And often they were just by the side of the trail, like this one, and like this one as well. There were some more substantial artillery positions on both Hong Kong Island and on the Kowloon side. This is a Devil's Peak, which is on the Kowloon side. This is a coastal artillery position, as it turns out. And there were various ammunition casemates and so on. And I also discovered that there were Japanese tunnel networks too, to complement the fortifications that had been built by the British. I'm not a big spelunker, but I can occasionally be convinced to go into one of these tunnels, but it's not my main gig. And I've also walked the battlefields. In this particular picture, that is me, and I'm near one of the areas that saw some of the fiercest fighting during the Japanese invasion of Hong Kong, when Japanese infantry units were engaging Canadian infantry platoons and companies up here in the hills of Hong Kong Island. Some of the fiercest fighting took place in this area. Anyways, I was hooked. I was curious. So I started reading everything I could about Hong Kong and World War II. And as it turns out, a lot has been written. And so I had a lot to read. And there were basically two kinds of things that had been written. And they were either historical type works by military historians. Not the Slightest Chance by Tony Bannum is a good example. Hong Kong Internment by my friend Jeff Emerson is a good example as well. And then we have memoirs. For example, we've got Victor Ebbage's memoir of his experience as a POW, and then Wright Newth's book, Prisoner of the Turnip Heads, is pretty well known as well, another prison memoir. As I read all these books, I kept coming across references to American airstrikes on Hong Kong. And they were just scattered throughout the books here and there. And they were incomplete. They were fragmentary references. They were sometimes contradictory. They sometimes appeared to be incorrect. It was a real jumble. And what became clear to me was that nobody had ever attempted to map out systematically the American air campaign against Japanese occupied Hong Kong. And so I decided that I would take this project on, because that to me sounded like a good story worth telling. And the result was my first book, or at least my first book on this subject, which was Bold Venture. And Bold Venture, when I was working on it, was this grand project where I was going to tell the whole story of the American air campaign against Japanese occupied Hong Kong, from its earliest moments in October 1942 to the end game in August 1945. And I was going to talk about the Army pilots, the Navy pilots. It's going to cover it all. The result was a manuscript that was so big that my editor said, "Steve, this sucker's too big. You got to cut it in half." And that was painful, but of course it was good advice. And what I did in the end was I decided Bold Venture would focus on the Army pilots. So the pilot
Right.
U.S. Army Air Forces who were based in China and later in the reoccupied Philippines. And the book focuses on the Army pilots. All the chapters about the Navy pilots I stripped out of the manuscript and put those aside as the seed corn, as it were, for the second book, which is Target Hong Kong, which focuses on the Navy pilots and really focuses on 2 days, January 15th and 16th, 1945, which was the only time that the Navy hit Hong Kong in strength and really pounded targets at Hong Kong. And that was pretty much the main show for the Navy, was those 2 days at Hong Kong. Which takes me to Operation Gratitude. And Operation Gratitude is the framework for the book as a whole, because those American airstrikes against Japanese occupied Hong Kong in January 1945 occurred as part of this much larger operation, Operation Gratitude. And Operation Gratitude was about a month long, and it began at the very end of December 1944, and it involved the Third Fleet of the U.S. Navy. And specifically, it involved the Fast Carrier Task Force, codenamed Task Force 38, under the command of Admiral Halsey. And this was the principal striking arm of the U.S. Navy, and really one of the most powerful armadas ever assembled. The composition of Task Force 38, aka the Fast Carrier Task Force, varied a bit on any given point in times, but most commonly the task force had about 12 carriers, a mix of fleet carriers and light carriers, and collectively could launch nearly 1,000 aircraft in theory. Now, operationally, practically, the number was lower than that, but still in theory, it could launch nearly 1,000 planes. And in addition to the core ships, which were the carriers, there was a very robust escorting screen of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, collectively about 100 ships, though again, the number varied. And Operation Gratitude begins at the end of December 1944, and the goal, the objective of the operation, is primarily to shield the American invasion force that is about to land in northern Luzon in the Philippines. And that's the end stage of the American reconquest of the Philippines. And the goal is to land at Luzon and drive south and take Manila. There are two fleets involved. There's Admiral Halsey's Task Force 38, which is part of the Third Fleet. And then there's a separate invasion fleet, which is the Seventh Fleet. And Halsey's carriers are going to shield the invasion fleet, primarily from Japanese air attack, because the Japanese had sizable air assets based in the Philippines as well as Formosa. There was also concern that surviving Japanese surface combatants might attempt to interfere with the invasion as well. The Japanese combined fleet at that point in time had been much reduced, particularly after the Battle of Leyte Gulf, but the combined fleet did still possess some powerful surface combatants, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and the worry was they might dash across the South China Sea to hit the Seventh Fleet, or dash south from the home islands again to hit the invasion fleet. And Task Force 38 was going to be there to block any such attempt.
I was just going to ask you a question, Stephen, but you actually answered it before I needed to, but just kind of my own satisfaction is that understanding that what was going to be happening in Luzon in the Philippines was massive news, not least of which because of MacArthur. And one of the things we've talked about on this channel again is kind of the idea that the general public can only kind of follow one timeline at a time. So if there's one big thing happening, even another thing that would on its own be counted as big, if it's slightly smaller than the other big thing, it kind of drops off the radar a bit. No pun intended, given that we're talking about the US Navy. But that seems to me the whole core of this is MacArthur, Luzon, the Philippines. It's massive. And this on any other day would be massive, but it's not quite as massive as that.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I think that at this given point in time, the focus is very much on the invasion of the Philippines and the Navy's role of screening that invasion, specifically Task Force 38's role, is kind of it's, I wouldn't say it's overlooked so much as it's just absorbed into that much bigger story that captured American attention at home.
And of course, someone just remind us the Battle of the Bulge is happening in Europe as well at this time, which is drawing attention.
Absolutely, yeah, no question.
Yeah, back to you.
Well, what we have here is a track chart of Task Force 38. So the black sort of squiggly line, that's showing the route that Task Force 38 took during Operation Gratitude. And Task Force 38 consisted of several smaller task groups, but nonetheless, in this particular case, it was operating as a single unit. So the track chart shows where Task Force 38 was during the approximately month-long operation. It begins at Ulithi, which is the forward operating base of the 3rd Fleet, and that's the blue arrow. And at the very end of December 1944, Task Force 38, Admiral Halsey, the carriers, commence Operation Gratitude and leave Ulithi, and they head on this sort of northwesterly bearing, and they hit targets at Formosa and also the extreme southern islands of Japan, the Nansei Shoto Islands, which include Okinawa. And the goal primarily is, again, to suppress Japanese air assets. Those initial strikes are followed by strikes against targets on Luzon, again, primarily, not exclusively, but primarily against airfields, and of course, shooting down any Japanese aircraft in the air as well. Follow-on strikes on Formosa, again, after Japanese air assets primarily. That's January 9th. So by this point, they've been at it for about 10 days. And it's right about at that point that Admiral Halsey is eager to switch his focus to targets other than airfields, because he wants to get into the South China Sea and hit port facilities, hit Japanese convoys. He basically wants to go into the South China Sea and hit anything and everything Japanese. And because at this point, it appears that Japanese air activity has been pretty soundly suppressed, and also because those Japanese surface combatants never appear, he's given permission to go after alternative targets. And so here on January 12th, Task Force 38 unleashes its air groups against French Indochina, and among other things, hits Saigon, but also catches several Japanese convoys. These are merchant ship convoys, catches them close inshore along the coast of French Indochina and essentially wipes them out and completely severs that particular maritime supply line. And in fact, I would say that this point in time is really the final moments of the Japanese merchant marine, where the last convoys are desperately trying to make the run south from the home islands to Singapore and other ports in Southeast Asia, and then make the run back to Japan with desperately needed raw materials. And the last convoys are trying to run right about at the time that Operation Gratitude happens. And this is important because as the carriers shift their attention north there's a Japanese tanker convoy that is trying to move south. And as you can see here on the 15th, the carrier air groups are hitting the coast of the south. They're hitting the South China coast and Formosa again. And meanwhile, this Japanese convoy is trying to dodge all these air attacks, and that convoy takes refuge in Hong Kong. And so on the 16th, when the air groups target Hainan and Hong Kong, what they find is that Victoria Harbor in Hong Kong has, in addition to the fixed targets like port facilities and so on, there's also an entire Japanese tanker convoy in the harbor as well. And January 16th is, of course, the focus of the book. However, Operation Gratitude does continue a bit longer. There are strikes again on Formosa and again on the Nansei Shoto Islands, and another follow-up strike on the Nansei Shoto, and then the fleet returns to Ulithi to conclude the operation. And the whole thing takes almost a month, not quite a month, but nearly so.
We had a question that's sort of representative of, I think, what people are thinking from Mad Cat about weren't Japanese tankers a high priority target? And I'm kind of going to add on that in that by this point of the war, the Japanese are kind of collapsing everywhere fast. Is it a case of rigidly sticking to operational orders, or is there kind of fluidity and targets opportunity being bought in and written into the kind of the mindset at this point? Because finally, everybody's got plenty of everything on the Allied side now. It's not the dark days of 42 and 43 anymore. So can they tackle more than one thing at the same time if something comes up, or is it rigid?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it was somewhat rigid initially during Operation Gratitude because there was so much concern about Japanese attempts to interfere with the invasion fleet. And as I said, the concerns were both air activity, but also that there might be some kind of attack by surface ships as well. But once the troops were ashore at Luzon, I mean, the landing was largely unopposed. They quickly had a beachhead. And once the Japanese air assets had been, they were never eliminated, but once they'd been somewhat suppressed, that sort of set of orders was relaxed, and Halsey did then have permission to pretty much hit whatever he wanted.
Okay.
And that's what we see in French Indochina and also in the Hong Kong strikes. For sure, yes, tankers were high priority targets, yes. Though Hong Kong would have been hit anyways, even if the tankers weren't in the harbor. That was more of a coincidental thing because Hong Kong in and of itself was considered a target worth hitting.
Okay, and then the last question, which is from me, is we've got Brad watching, who did a show with us a couple of years ago about the Canadians in Hong Kong in the early part of the war. Is there any kind of Canadian intelligence part of this in that they have been in Hong Kong earlier? Is there anybody involved in this with on the ground knowledge? I mean, you don't necessarily need to know that to attack it from the air, but is there any kind of non-American intelligence aspect to this?
Yeah, it's not Canadian. It is true that during the Japanese invasion of Hong Kong in 1941, a significant component of the defending force consisted of Canadian infantry battalions. Yeah. So the battle for Hong Kong is actually very well known in Canada, perhaps more than in Britain, or certainly.
Oh, definitely. It's definitely a big Canadian story.
Yeah. However, in terms of intelligence sources on Hong Kong in 1945, there were certainly lots of avenues for getting that intelligence.
Okay.
And principally that there were quite a few. One would be the British Army Aid Group, which was a British unit that was comprised of mostly British servicemen and Chinese service members who had fled Hong Kong after the colony fell, and who then created this unit, the British Army Aid Group, that was an intelligence agency that was able to provide intel on Hong Kong. That was one. The U.S. Navy also had clandestine units in South China. as well, and they would have had intel on Hong Kong. The OSS was operating actually in Hong Kong, believe it or not. So there were sources there. And then, of course, the 14th Air Force was flying recon flights over Hong Kong on an almost daily basis. And the U.S. Navy's own patrol bombers based in the southern Philippines were also overhead. So there was actually a lot of intel over Hong Kong and about Hong Kong, though, as I'll speak about in a bit, it didn't always get to the right people, and there were some friendly fire incidents that perhaps could have been avoided
Okay.
with better intel.
Brilliant. Thanks. Back to you. We're loving it.
Yeah. Okay. So Operation Gratitude is massive. It's huge. And my book is not an attempt to chronicle Operation Gratitude. That's too big. And so I wanted to bring the focus down to a specific aspect of that operation, and particularly something that interested me was Hong Kong. So I thought, well, I'll focus on Hong Kong. And so the book is really focusing on January 16th, 1945, when the air groups from Task Force 38 just piled on and hit Hong Kong all day long. And that's the focus as opposed to the entire operation. In addition, I wanted to narrow things down to a few specific people, because again, I wanted to take this huge operation and get it down to a human scale. So first, I narrowed the focus to Hong Kong, and then I narrowed the focus to 7 or 8 characters that were deeply involved in these airstrikes and whose stories were interesting. And by recounting their experiences, I could then give the bigger picture of what happened that day. And of these characters, and I say characters, but they are, these are real people. The story is a true one, but still I refer to them as characters because they're in a story. 6 of them are Navy pilots and air crewmen, but one guy is a British soldier, prisoner of war. His name's Ray Jones. And Ray Jones, Raymond Eric Jones, is my through line character. He's the guy whose story anchors the entire book. And he's critically important because he's my guy on the ground. The naval characters, the pilots and the rear seat gunners, they're in the air, they're overhead, and that's their perspective. Ray Jones, on the other hand, he's a prisoner of war. He's on the ground, so he's witnessing the airstrikes. And so he becomes sort of the eyewitness. His story is really a fascinating one, and it's perhaps the one I know the best of all the characters because, among other things, I had a transcript of his wartime diary, which he kept while he was a prisoner, and which survived. The diary survived the war. So I had the diary. I was also in touch with his family, specifically his daughter. So I had the perspective of the family as well. And of course, I've been to the site of where he was held prisoner as well. So I had a pretty good sense of who he was, and I was able to get inside his head, so to say, and tell his story. It's a fascinating one. He was a Royal Navy submariner for I believe it was about 14 years. He was in for quite a while, and he basically went to sea as a young man. And when he mustered out, he had acquired a taste for exotic locales and took a position at Hong Kong as an expatriate. And he was working for Stanley Prison at Hong Kong. So he was a prison warden. And he, at the same time, was carrying on a long distance romance with a woman named Marjorie Cumming back in England. And eventually they got married, and Marge came out to Hong Kong and joined Ray. And they were living a really privileged expatriate lifestyle in the pre-war years. And it's right about that time that Ray Jones starts keeping his diary. And as a diary keeper, he was terse but diligent, meaning that he wrote something in his diary every day. He was responsible. in that sense. But his entries are short, they're cryptic, they've got a lot of strange abbreviations, and they can be a little hard to follow. But still, they say so much about his experiences and what he was interested in. Particularly, he was interested in the weather. He was really interested in war news. And of course, he talked about his job. And in fact, he sometimes would have these strange juxtapositions in his journal entries where, the first line might be about some social event, some kind of party where there was a dinner dance or something. And then in the next line, he's talking about the guy they hanged at the prison that day. And so it can be a bit of a back and forth in his journal entries. But at any rate, by about 1941, it's clear that hostilities with Japan are likely. And for that reason, Marge is evacuated to Australia, and Ray Jones is left by himself in Hong Kong. And he is a member of the Stanley Platoon, which is a small unit of the Hong Kong Volunteer Defense Corps, which is it's like a local militia, very roughly analogous to the National Guard here in the U.S. or the Territorial Army back in Britain. And the Stanley Platoon's role in wartime is, as the name suggests, to defend the Stanley Peninsula, which is on the south side of Hong Kong Island. It is comprised of prison guards primarily. Most of the prison guards have military service. And although the garrison at Hong Kong does lack a lot of key pieces of equipment, like, for example, tanks or fighter aircraft, it is very well equipped when it comes to infantry weapons. So the Stanley Platoon is really well fitted out with modern infantry weapons, machine guns and so on, grenades, the lot. And the men are pretty well trained. So when war does finally break out on December 8th, 1941, they're ready. And I say December 8th because of the international date line. The Japanese invasion of Hong Kong occurred simultaneously with the strikes on Pearl Harbor, but we have the date line, hence December 8th. They come over the border. The Japanese come over the border into Hong Kong. They very quickly force the British garrison out of what is called the New Territories. That's basically the mainland portion of Hong Kong. The garrison falls back to Hong Kong Island and hunkers down for what they expect to be an extended siege. The Japanese bombard the island. They try to convince the governor to surrender the island. The governor refuses. And after about another week, the Japanese come across Victoria Harbor in an amphibious assault, and they very quickly get a beachhead and push their way across the center of the island, split the defending forces in half, and half of the defenders end up on the Stanley Peninsula. They're sort of bottled up on the peninsula. It's an ideal place for a last stand. And I always say that in the case of Ray Jones, he didn't have to go to the front lines as a member of the Stanley Platoon. The front lines came to him because the Japanese, of course, by about December 23rd, they're pushing right down the Stanley Peninsula. And Ray Jones and the Stanley Platoon are right in the way. And they're in the thick of the fight. It's a fully automatic battle. Everybody's got machine guns. There's lots of artillery fire. It's bloody. Buildings change hands multiple times. And the upshot, though, is that by December 25th, the garrison is forced to surrender. Ray Jones is still keeping his diary. And on the next day after the surrender, he writes in his diary that it's no fun to have to surrender, and he's not looking forward to being a POW, but he's really relieved that he's not going to be blown to pieces. All right, so Ray Jones, he goes into the Stanley civilian internment camp. And note the word civilian, because this is a bit of a mystery because, of course, Ray Jones was a uniformed, armed combatant. He was a rifleman. But somehow he ends up in the civilian camp with all the other Allied civilians that the Japanese round up in Hong Kong. And I don't know how this happened, but I can suppose, it's just supposition, but I can suppose that after the surrender, he and the other prison guards returned to work. They put on their prison uniforms, their prison guard uniforms, and went back to the prison. And when the Japanese started rounding up all the Allied civilians, they found the prison guards, classified them as civilians, and sent them to the camp, because a lot of the prison guards ended up in the camp. And interestingly, so did the police, who also were militia during the battle for Hong Kong. But at the point when the Japanese were sending civilians into this camp on the Stanley Peninsula, the police were seen as civilians and sent to the camp. In the camp on the Stanley Peninsula, there were initially several thousand Allied civilians, mostly British, some American, a few Dutch, and a handful of other nationalities. And conditions in the camp were never great, but they get progressively worse as the war goes on. The camp is ringed by a barbed wire fence, as you might expect. Prisoners can't leave. The Japanese aren't sending much food in. They're not sending in much in the way of medicine, so conditions in the camp are quite difficult. And the prisoners are struggling to survive. Ray Jones continues to keep his diary. He's noting all the war news that he can kind of glean from whatever sources he can. And in early January 1945, believe it or not, with a pair of binoculars, he's able to see a Japanese tanker convoy coming around below the Stanley Peninsula and heading in to Victoria Harbor. The interesting thing is the Japanese never confiscated his binoculars. You might think that's the kind of thing they'd want to take away from a prisoner, but they never did. And Ray Jones was a pretty good ship watcher, so he noted this convoy and that it was unusual, because by that stage of the war, there wasn't much in the way of Japanese shipping coming in and out of Hong Kong. And then a few days after he notes this tanker convoy, he and the other prisoners see single-engine planes coming in from the sea. And it's clear they're not Japanese planes. And so the prisoners are pretty excited, because they're thinking, this is a good sign. If these planes are coming in from the sea, they're probably Allied planes. And since most of the prisoners are British, they're thinking, yeah, and there must be Royal Navy. But, they soon determine, no, these are American planes. They've got to be carrier planes. They're coming in from the sea and they're single engine. And then they start hearing these planes fly overhead, and then they start hearing the explosions as they're hitting targets at Victoria Harbor. The prisoners can hear this action. They can't see it because they're on the south side of the island. The center of the island is a mountain. The far side is the harbor. So they can see the planes. They can hear the explosions. They can't see the action at the harbor. So January 16th, 1945, Ray Jones is witnessing the action, and the objective of the airstrikes on Hong Kong include a variety of targets. Hong Kong has some of the best dockyards in Asia. So the dockyards, the Taikoo Dockyard, the Hong Kong and Whampoa Dockyard, the former Royal Navy Dockyard, which had been captured, those are all targets. The Kai Tak Airfield is a target. The various oil and petroleum storage facilities, those are targets. And then, of course, the tanker convoy itself is a target. And the tanker convoy is anchored in the harbor, and that's the sort of red explosion there on the left-hand side of the map. In the morning, there are two strikes: strikes A, strike B. Strike A and strike B focus primarily on the dockyards, and especially the Taiku dockyard. And this photo is showing a plane pulling up out of its dive after hitting the Taiku dockyard. And I like this photo because it gives a sense of the mountainous topography of Victoria Harbor and how it's ringed by ridge lines and mountains that rise almost to 2,000 feet. And 2,000 feet is not Mount Everest, but it's pretty tall when it's shooting straight up out of the water. In the afternoon, strikes C and strikes D shift focus and spend more of their ordnance against the tankers that are anchored off of what is called Kennedy Town off Hong Kong Island. And here in the red circles are 3 of the 5 tankers that were in that convoy. And it's a little hard to see, but one of the tankers is already low by the stern, so it's already been hit. And it appears that another one's on fire. We do know that all 3 tankers were ultimately destroyed. There were 3 different aircraft types involved, and I think many people listening to me speak here are familiar with these aircraft. There was the F-6F Hellcat, which was, of course, the primary fighter aircraft of the U.S. Navy at this time. Its role during Operation Gratitude was primarily a bodyguard type role, where the Hellcats were protecting the Helldivers and the Avengers, which were the dive bombers and the torpedo planes of the fleet. And basically the goal of the Hellcat pilots was to suppress Japanese air activity and protect the bombers.
And what, I know you're going to get to that, but what about flak on the ground as well? Is there ground positions, or is there any in the harbor itself, or the harbors?
Yeah, I will get to that. The flak is really heavy. Yeah.
Okay, well, I will shut up and let you carry on.
Yeah, there's a twist though, and I'll get to that in just a moment.
Cool.
Anyways, it's a good point though, because one of the roles of the Hellcat is not just to suppress Japanese air activity, but also to suppress Japanese anti-aircraft positions as well.
Right.
But again, that's sort of a bodyguard role, right? In the sense that you're suppressing the flak positions to protect the incoming bombers.
Okay, thank you.
The other second aircraft involved was the Helldiver, the SB-2C, which was the dive bomber, and not a particularly glamorous aircraft, but nonetheless effective. Had an internal bomb bay, could carry a very large bomb load. Is pretty rugged. Pilots, I think, respected it in terms of flying it. It could be squirrely to fly, but still an effective aircraft to be sure. And then, of course, there is the TBM Avenger, which is the plane that's on the cover of the book. And this is the torpedo plane, but that, although it's called a torpedo bomber, this is really a Swiss Army knife of a plane. It can do so many things, and it has an internal bomb bay that will hold a torpedo. So it's a pretty capacious bomb bay, but it could hold any kind of combination of bombs, and it could glide bomb, or it could do a level bombing run from altitude. It can carry a depth charge, right? So it could go after submarines. They're radar equipped, so they can be radar pickets. They can do all kinds of scouting and recon runs. They can sort of be improvised search and rescue aircraft, because the crewman in the back can open the hatch and drop extra life rafts out to people in the water. And there was even a case where a land-based Avenger squadron had rigged up these improvised crop dusting units, and they were flying over the rice paddies and vegetable fields tended by starving Japanese soldiers in the jungles of the Southwest Pacific, with the goal of killing off the food they were trying to raise, because these were Japanese units that had been, marooned behind the lines and had no resupply and were starving. So it was a versatile aircraft, and uniquely had 3 crewmen. So there's the pilot, then there's the gunner in the rotating turret with the 50 cal, and there's also the guy who's in the belly of the beast in what's known as the tunnel, who was sort of a radio man. He was also a gunner. He had a little 30 cal. You can see it poking out from the back of the aircraft.
Could you go back a couple of slides to the other way? Because we're having people ask about the pod underneath the aircraft. Is that radar? Is it whatever that what? Yeah.
You know, I am not 100% certain of this, but I actually think that's a gun pod.
Okay.
Which, to my knowledge, was a fairly unusual thing for a helldiver to be carrying at this point in time. This is the horseshoe emblem there on the tail. That tells us this is VB7 off the Hancock. So I haven't come across any references to gun pods, reading all their aircraft action reports and stuff. So I can't say with certainty that I have that right, but that's my best guess.
Okay, cheers. Thank you.
So the Avenger features prominently in the book. It's also the plane that takes a lot of casualties, or many Avengers are lost to that heavy Japanese flak. The Japanese, interestingly, in the morning during strikes A and strike B, in the morning, the Japanese approach to air defense gunnery seemed to be basically, I mean, I'm simplifying, but basically the approach seemed to be shoot one gun at one plane and try to hit it.
Right.
Kind of like shooting a rifle at a bird on the wing. And if you've ever tried that, it's a pretty tough shot. And so in the morning, the Japanese just aren't hitting anything. Now, the Navy pilots coming into Victoria are astonished by the volume of the flak. I mean, they can't believe it, and they're amazed that nothing's getting hit. And during strikes A and strike A and strike B, only 2 planes are lost. Hundreds go in the face of this heavy fire, but only 2 are hit, only 2 go down. And then there's this fatal midday gap, and the pilots are not happy about this, but this is nonetheless what happens. And during this midday gap, the Japanese have time to rethink their tactics. And what they decide is that the one gun at one plane approach, that doesn't work. So they decide they're going to try what's called a box barrage. And basically, it just kind of means putting as much flak as you can in a given point in the sky, and then force the enemy to fly through it. And the topography of the harbor kind of allows for this, because it's basically a bowl where planes have to come over the ridge lines and dive down, and then they have to exit out through the mouths of the harbor, because the planes they're not going to pull up once they're down on the deck. They're going to stay on the deck and then go out the mouths of the harbor. So the Japanese kind of know where the planes are going to be. And so when Strike C shows up, the results are, from a Japanese perspective, pretty good, and from an American perspective, pretty bad. And immediately planes start going down. And the total is about 15 planes are lost in the afternoon during strikes C and D, contrasted with just 2 in the morning. Here in this picture, we see what is believed to be the crash site of an Avenger that was trying to make a torpedo run against the tankers, which you can see on the right-hand side of the photo. And the torpedo runs didn't work because the torpedoes apparently went into the mud of the harbor. It was low tide, the harbor's not that deep, and the torpedoes were all they called them mudders, because they went into the mud. There were no known torpedo hits that day. And of course, the torpedo bombers themselves were quite vulnerable, because they have to fly straight and level as they come in, and straight, level, and low. And so they were getting shot up pretty bad. And this is not confirmed, but I'm pretty sure that smoke plume there is the crash site in
Mm.
Kowloon of a TBM Avenger, probably flown by a pilot named Size, Lieutenant Size.
Okay, thank you. And just a question for me, really, it's this isn't Midway anymore. This isn't the part of the war where we're absolutely desperate for any kind of victory, and there's the risk reward thing is completely in favor of the risk. You know, the Allies are taking risks. Therefore, this is early 45 now. The writing is on the wall. When you know this strike, when they're going in and losing aircraft, is there any chance that people say, well, we're going to just we've lost too many, any more aircraft, let's go back to base? Or is it kind of a press on in? Is there any kind of wiggle room for pulling out if the losses are too bad at this point of the war?
Well, that's a good question. When the commanders of the air groups were reflecting back on the day, that they weren't there was no resistance to striking Hong Kong. None of them were saying we shouldn't have gone in, but they were definitely criticizing the tactics that were used.
Right.
And one of the things that came in for a lot of criticism was the decisions made about the loadings for the aircraft. For example, the torpedo runs were just seen as idiocy by the pilots. And there was also a lot of criticism about the fact that there was very poor target coordination as well. And the problem seemed to be that although there were strike commanders for the task groups, there was no overall strike commander for the task force.
Right.
And so it meant that some targets were getting hit too much, often at the same time. So then different squadrons were getting in each other's way. And then other targets weren't getting hit enough. And maybe the planes didn't have the right weapons to hit those targets. So there was a lot of criticism about the tactics after the fact. But I don't think there's any reluctance to go full in and pound the place, though.
Okay.
One of the pilots lost was another one of my key characters, a guy named Lieutenant Richard Hunt. His family called him Joe or Joe Dick, and he's, again, one of those characters I feel like I know pretty well, in part because although I didn't have them at the point when I was writing the book, I've since read his wartime letters, which his family generously shared with me. And in addition, I've also visited the crash site of his aircraft on Hong Kong Island. He was lost during Strike 2C. He was flying in with his squadron, VT-7 from the Hancock, and over Hong Kong Island, he collided with a second Avenger flown by his wingman and good friend, a guy named Lieutenant Scoble, and both planes went in and hit ridgelines on Hong Kong Island. And Lieutenant Hunt managed to bail out. He was badly injured. He was quite literally on fire. He's able to bail out. I mean, he just had seconds to get out of his aircraft, but he did get out. And Ray Jones on the ground, he sees all this. That's what's so interesting, is that these two planes are colliding and exploding, and down there in the Stanley prison camp, these Allied civilians see it all. They see Hunt bail out. They see Scoble attempt to bail out. His parachute gets tangled in the tail of his aircraft, and he's dragged to his death when the plane hits the ridgeline. The gunners don't get out; they die too. And the Ray Jones and the other civilians are horrified. They've seen Allied planes before. They've even seen Allied air raids before, but they've never seen an Allied plane get shot down. It's really quite horrific to witness. Yeah, Lieutenant Scoble was as I said, the pilot of the second plane that went down. And Lieutenant Hunt came down in the Tai Tam Valley, which is in more or less the center of Hong Kong Island. There's a reservoir there. Today it's a country park. And when his plane hit the ridgeline, again, the the prisoners could see the point where it struck the ridge line. They could see the explosion and so on. But post-war, after the MIA teams had recovered the remains of the 5 crewmen who had died on those 2 planes, post-war, the jungle regreened the hillside and the wreckage kind of disappeared. And so it wasn't until many years later, I think it was 2011, a guy named Craig Mitchell, who does similar kind of research to what I do, started bushwhacking up in the hills because he thought he had a pretty good idea where these 2 planes had crashed, and he wondered if there was still any wreckage up there. And sure enough, there was. He eventually found it. Here's Craig at the crash site of Lieutenant Hunt's Avenger. And although the Avenger completely disintegrated when it hit the ridgeline, the armor, unsurprisingly, the armor survived the crash. And so Craig here is by the curved armor for the turret gun of Lieutenant Hunt's Avenger. There's various other pieces of wreckage. Here we can see one of the 50 cal wing guns, and the fact that the barrel is bent tells you something about the violence of the crash. There's landing gear assemblies, and I'm not certain of this. I think this is an ammunition feed chute, but I'm not sure. It's my best guess. And there were even pieces that still had the standard navy blue paint still visible. And then, most amazingly, at least from my perspective, was that we found Lieutenant Hunt's armored headrest. And
Wow.
This was quite incredible to me because I was thinking, all right, here's, this isn't some random piece of steel. This is the headrest that Lieutenant Hunt had his head against in the last seconds when he was in his aircraft, just before he bailed out. And here it is all those years later. And I should say that Lieutenant Hunt's story didn't end well either, and perhaps that made finding his headrest even more poignant. He was captured, as I said. He was shipped to Ofuna POW camp in Japan, and he died of untreated wounds and mistreatment, cold, exposure, starvation, and was buried on the temple grounds adjacent to the POW camp. So his story, it doesn't end well. It's a tragic story, really.
And people are asking, what has happened to the artifacts?
Yeah. The artifacts have all since been recovered. So a team of archaeologists and other experts, a lot of them were academics, systematically did an archaeological dig at the wreck site. And so all the pieces that you're seeing here in my presentation, as well as everything else that they collected, has been preserved in a climate-controlled space in Hong Kong. And the hope is that this will eventually be presented in some kind of museum-type setting down the road.
Brilliant.
Yeah, and I'm holding probably the largest intact piece of the aircraft right there. As I said, it did disintegrate upon impact. So I know we're hitting about the hour mark, so I just wanted to close with a quick shout out to Molly and Ellie, Craig's dogs, who kept us safe from snakes, of which there are an abundance on Hong Kong Island, and wild boars, of which there are also an abundance on Hong Kong Island. So Molly and Ellie, thank you for keeping us safe and being our early warning system.
Fantastic. And I mean, when you're researching on a completely personal note, when you're researching a project as big as this, it's been with you for a long time, it can get a bit bogged down in takeoff times and data, but then this brings it all down to being, as you said right at the beginning, about people. Carrier movements and 1,000 aircraft and 100 ships is numbers. When finding something like that and being part of that is what makes history tangible and connects it and makes it personal.
Yep. I totally agree. I mean, it's the stories of these characters that kept me writing the book and drew me in, and which I hope draws the reader in too.
Yeah. So yeah, are we doing more? I forgot what you said. Are you doing more, or are we leaving it at that?
I can take questions at this point
Sure.
if the audience has any.
I mean, I'm going to ask kind of the outcome, the military purpose. You know, were the planners happy with the outcome? I mean, obviously, probably more aircraft lost than they were anticipating, but was it considered successful?
It's a good question. Yeah, I think it depends who you ask, and I guess if you read, like, if you read the various after action reports, there were two threads. One thread was, yes, we pounded Hong Kong. We really pounded it, which was true. And then the other thread were those criticisms I mentioned earlier, where air group commanders were thinking over how things went and coming up with some pretty pointed criticisms of how things could have been done better. A better target coordination, a rethink of the combat loadings for the aircraft, and so on.
Sorry.
But here's the thing. That's a Navy perspective. And if you broaden the focus and bring in the Army Air Forces, the picture changes completely, because the Army pilots first bombed Hong Kong in October of 1942. And there was a bit of a gap after that. And then they picked up in earnest in 43, and they just kept pounding Hong Kong right up to almost the end of the war. And the final raids were actually flown by the 5th Air Force out of the Philippines. Those were B-24 heavy bombing raids. And they really pounded Hong Kong. My point being that the Army pilots would have said, why did the Navy even bother? We've been hitting Hong Kong for years. And not only that, we're just hitting our stride. We're going to continue to pound it. And so in that sense, the need to hit Hong Kong in the first place is questionable, because the Army Air Forces were able to target Hong Kong on their own, and had been doing so and would continue to do so. So it how successful the airstrikes were, kind of depends on your perspective. Yes, they did a lot of damage, but the Army Air Forces could have done it anyways, or in some cases already had, and the Navy pilots were just making the rubble bounce.
And we had a question about, or comment about, the fact, were there any Allied submarines operating in and around Hong Kong? Because that is one of the less told stories, is just how effective the American submarines were in the latter part of the war, and indeed the British submarines as well, which are, a very, very high reward for generally minimal cost at this point of the war, although there were some tragic instances of POW ships being hit. So that's a good point. But you mentioned the Army Air Corps doing their stuff. Is there a submarine kind of connection? Is it a combined arms approach at this point?
Absolutely, yeah. One of the things that is significant about Operation Gratitude is that it was the first time since the start of the war that U.S. Navy surface vessels had been in the South China Sea. But of course, submarines had been operating there throughout the entire war.
Yeah.
And during Operation Gratitude, there were some submarines offshore. They were lifeguard submarines. So their mission was to pick up any downed aviators who went into the water. And interestingly, one of those submarines, believe it or not, was named the Guardfish. And so the Guardfish was offshore, standing by to pick up any Navy pilots that went into the water. During the Hong Kong strikes, any pilots who went into the water were not recovered. There were some, but submarines didn't pick any up. And the Guardfish never did rescue any sailors. And on the way home, sadly, it actually torpedoed a U.S. Navy ship. And obviously that's a friendly fire incident in a major kind of way, but it mapped onto a much larger pattern of friendly fire incidents during Operation Gratitude, which I say non-judgmentally, right? Because given the scale of the violence unleashed by Operation Gratitude Friendly Fire was inevitable, if if regrettable, and there were many such incidents.
Okay, thank you. And people asking about the army getting in the way of the navy,
Yep.
and that kind of thing happens a lot, unfortunately. With the this is the issue the Allies have by having lots of everything by now, is that the
Yep.
more of everything you have in the sky and on the air, the more chance of there being coordination, accidental problems. Had a great question from Scott Grimwood of how is the raid remembered today in Hong Kong? Because there are other things happening in the Pacific where that was the only sort of, liberation of certain places in the battle was the only thing that ever happened there for years and years. But in Hong Kong, lots of history in the next few decades. So is it
Yeah.
remembered?
In short, no.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say that.
I would say that the people of Hong Kong, I think, are well aware of the fact that Hong Kong was occupied by the Japanese for nearly 4 years, and that it was a very harsh occupation. And I think that's remembered. But the American bombing of Hong Kong, I think very few people are aware of.
Yeah, and it's a sad thing, and people are just asking who liberated that area eventually, because the Hong Kong area, because I have to say I can't think on the top of my head. Is it the British?
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting story too. It's one I only touch upon in the book.
Yeah.
Other people have written about it, but essentially, at the end of the war, Hong Kong was still under Japanese control, and so there was a bit of a power vacuum once the emperor had surrendered Japan. It was a little unclear who was going to control Hong Kong. The Japanese military was still nominally in control. The Allied civilians were coming out of the camps with the POWs, and they were trying to reassert British authority. There was some concern that the communist guerrillas would attempt to sweep into Hong Kong and claim it. There was some concern that the nationalist Chinese would then sweep into
Yeah.
Hong Kong to preempt the communists,
Yeah.
and then the
Yeah.
British were worried they'd never get it back. So the upshot is, about 2 weeks after the surrender, a British task group under Admiral Harcourt steams into Victoria Harbor and accepts the swords of the Japanese commanders at Hong Kong. And the surrender is peaceful.
So my last question is about the study of the kind of spring into summer 1945 period in this part of the world, because we now all know that massive events happened in the summer, August, atomic bombs, and which people didn't. Okay, the Manhattan Project probably knew about it, but your average U.S. Navy pilot, British guy, and a carrier, this had no idea what was going to be happening that summer. Which people then said, so a lot of the things happening in the spring and summer may not have needed to be mounted. There were operations that we could have just waited. Whereas earlier, as I mentioned, places like Midway and Leyte Gulf a year earlier, these are essential. That they have to be done. But there is now this understanding that an end was going to come. Does that make studying battles that maybe history has said, well, we didn't need to do that? Does that add a layer of kind of complexity when you're studying this era?
I suppose it does. I'm not sure that my book really touches on that. I was sort of focusing on the stories of these men at a very specific moment in time. And I think from their perspective, I think, understood that Japan had lost the war, but I don't think they had a clear sense of when it was going to end. And I think they expected to be fighting longer than ultimately they were. And I don't, in the book, analyze big questions like, should the bomb have been dropped, or things like that. I'm more focusing on, okay, the mission was hit Hong Kong, and how did it go, and what were
I
the
think it's that
experiences?
idea of whether, when you're writing about history, whether you kind of let the audience kind of subconsciously know that there are events going to be happening later on that may or did influence the importance of this, but not at the time. That's, I know,
Yes.
talking to Peter Caddick Adams about the ETO, is that he finds generally audiences start losing interest in the British Army in the West, come about March and April 45, because they know, they can't help knowing that VE Day happens in May. But if you're fighting into Germany in March or April, you don't know VE Day is going to happen in May. You're hoping there's going to be a victory coming, but you don't know. And those operations were mounted with the same vigor, the same risk, the same, charging over a hill towards a machine gun doesn't make any difference at that point, whether you're 2 weeks away from the end of the war or 2 years. You don't know that till later on. But it means, I think, people's interests start, as the readers start declining as the end of the war comes in sight.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I try to point out in the book is, for example, Ray Jones. He's in this prison camp, and he has a pretty good sense of how the war's going. He was clever, so in various ways he was able to figure out how the war was going, and he knew the Japanese were losing. But the thing that the prisoners didn't know was whether they were going to survive the war, because their fear was that particularly if there was an attempt by the Allies to retake Hong Kong, that any prisoners would be massacred by the Japanese. And so from Ray Jones's perspective, he doesn't know if he's going to survive the war, even if he knows the end of the war might be in sight. His future is very much in doubt by his own estimation. And I try to convey that because, of course, it would have been a very terrifying place to be.
Yeah, that's a very good point you made. I'm glad you made that, because all across, people held by the Japanese, as cruel as they had been earlier and as meager as rations were, there was sort of a stability about the situation. As the war is coming in, there is this fear of what's going to happen. Are they just going to massacre us? Are they going to transport us somewhere else and leave us there? Uncertainty is a huge fear, and I mean it's even happening in the ETO as well. I mean, Masters of the Air touched on that in the Stalags there. What's going to happen? The middle part had been kind of an acceptance of the misery and the routine, but there were kind of not so many surprises. But by 45, there are surprises around the corner. But we're going off into a rabbit hole that was which we will do another time. People are saying to invite you back to talk about your first book. So if you want to do that, you're welcome to. People have said that in the
my pleasure.
So,
yeah.
But in the meantime, I think we've all learned something. So again, folks, I'll hold up my copy of the book there. The poster's on the wall behind Stephen there. So some people have already said they bought it. So that's great. Just a quick question about how, it's kind of off the subject. People are asking about how many civilian POW camps there were in that kind of part of the world, because there are. Have you got a quick answer to that?
Well, I don't have specific numbers, but I can say that there were multiple camps. There were several in Shanghai, for example, and there were quite a few in the Dutch East Indies as well. What was unique about the camp in Hong Kong was that, well, for one, it was co-ed in the sense that it had men and women and quite a few children, and that was not always the case in other civilian camps. And the other unique thing was that the civilian authorities, the civilian pre-war authorities in Hong Kong were still functioning after the occupation enough that they were able to convince the Japanese to put the civilian prison camp on the Stanley Peninsula, which was a pretty healthy place to put a prison camp because it had sea breezes, it was rocky, so there wasn't too much malaria, and it was a good place if such a place exists.
Comparatively speaking,
yeah, it was a good place to put a camp. It was relatively healthy. So,
and we're going to the rabbit hole. We've touched that in the past on the show about the vision everybody has of a camp controlled by the Japanese is the very worst of the kind of the Burma Thai railway, and there were others that weren't as bad as that, or they were bad in different ways. And there is not one model of internment stroke camp that the Japanese were using, and so it's a whole complex subject. Most of it's pretty awful, but there are less degrees of awful and far worse degrees of awful.
That's exactly how I would put it. Right, they were all bad, but some were horrific. Yeah.
Well, Stephen, it's been fantastic talking to you, folks. We're back with Mark Zelke tomorrow talking about the Leary Valley in Monte Cassino and lots more stuff coming your way. But right now, I'm going to end things and say thank you very much for your fantastic questions. Thank you to people like Brad for answering them before we had to bring them to Stephen. And I will see you all again tomorrow. This is Paul Widows. Don't forget, click, like, and subscribe. Buy my guest books because that helps pay them their bills to do another one. And I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.